We have got a brother Kingservant joining us. Long time no see, brother Kingservant. I hope you're well. Hope your family's well. I think he just turned his camera off. Maybe he's a bit busy. I just have a question. Just taking off that particular track. Why is Papias unreliable when it comes to recording the Gospels or attributing the Gospels to certain individuals? Can you share something?
Yes, I'm not aware of which scholar says that Papias is unreliable, but from what I understand, Papias is seen as like an obscure source, which we don't really know much about. And also the descriptions that he gives, like of the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, he seems to be describing a different gospel to the Gospels that we have in the New Testament.
Okay, excellent. Hi, Kingservant. I don't know if you heard us. I hope you're doing well. I hope your family's well. Long time no see. You're looking well. How are you, brother? You're muted. We still can't hear you. Is it? Go on, do it again, Kingservant. Maybe he'll come back, inshallah. But yeah, Kingservant's well known to cover faith and to the YouTube channel. Very friendly individual, and I have hosted various discussions with Kingservant and Brother Yemeni, and even yourself, Brother Nazam. So
Yeah,
he's
Kingservant is like the best person to like speak to. So.
yeah, he's back
Yeah.
again. Okay, I'll do
Also,
back
just to
to
add
you
one
now.
more quick point in terms of what Sam has made mention about, there's also no eschatological issues, which is prevalent in the letters of Paul and in some accounts, Mark's account. But there is no mention, in addition to no passion narrative within the sayings of Gospel of Thomas. There's also no eschatological matters which are discussed either.
Hi, Kingservant. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can now. Thanks.
Oh, it's a lot better now.
I just went to get my sword, and then something happened when my Wi-Fi went down in between, so I just left and came back in. Thanks.
Nice to see you anyway. It's good to see
Yeah,
you.
you too.
Yeah, it's good. Anything that you want to share and your thoughts about the Gospel of Thomas, and what's your take on the scholars or the Jesus seminar?
Well, I mean, if we start with the Gospel of Thomas, for what it is, I think I would agree, broadly speaking, with the perspective that Nazam put forward and how the Gospel of Thomas is generally seen. It's an early 2nd century Gospel, so it's not as a work in and of itself as early as anything that we find of the 4 Gospels, or I would argue any book in the New Testament. But there are certainly parts in it which are dated to much earlier, 2nd century. I would strongly question the idea that it would be as early as AD 50, even in any part of it, but nevertheless, 1st century for sure. That's perfectly reasonable. But the Gospel of Thomas is, number one, Thomas never wrote it. That's like the first key point, right? And there's no scholar, Christian or non-Christian, who will say that they think Thomas wrote the Gospel of Thomas. And secondarily, the content of the Gospel of Thomas is thoroughly Gnostic. It reflects heretical, later sect of Christianity, which isn't Christianity at all. This view of the flesh being evil and creation being evil, and this being something that we need to escape from. And there's all sorts of theology that goes with that, which is completely foreign to the New Testament. And most scholars would agree that the New Testament actually directly opposes. So that's what the Gospel of Thomas is. I can describe my perspective on the Jesus seminar more broadly if you'd like, but I don't want to overtake the show, so I'll say that for now and I can come back.
Oh no, please feel free. I mean, I'm not like the main speaker or anything like that, so it's like an open forum. So
yeah, well, thank you, Nizam. In that case, when it comes to the Jesus seminar, as I was describing in the chat, they represent the extreme left of New Testament scholarship, by which I mean the least conservative, the most skeptical, the least likely to believe anything that we have in the New Testament or really any of our sources. So I think Nizam did get a little bit confused when he was talking about the colors of the marbles, but in broadly speaking, he was right in what he said. They graded them and voted on how authentic they thought a saying of Jesus was, or how likely it was for him to have said it, based on throwing marbles into a bag and counting the marbles afterwards, which is pretty amusing. But it shows the kind of lack of respect that they have for any of the sources that they're looking at. It's mentioned, Robert Price is one of the members of the Jesus Seminar. The discussion I had with him wasn't specifically on the Gospel of Thomas, but rather, did Jesus exist or not? Because he argues he didn't. And that was a pretty interesting conversation, for one thing, because he actually compares the writings of the early church fathers like Irenaeus and so forth with the Hadith from his own perspective as somebody who believes Jesus never existed. He makes that comparison in order to make the church fathers sound unreliable. I mean, sure, he's not a scholar of Islam, but it's interesting that he would actually choose those kinds of comparisons himself. But obviously, he's the extreme left of the extreme left, right? He's the only New Testament scholar there is who believes that Jesus never existed or takes that as his position. So, yeah, you're talking more like Robert Funk, John Dominic Crossan, these kinds of individuals. So, yeah, they usually take certain bare facts of Jesus' life as accepted. His baptism, his death by crucifixion, one or two other incidents in his life. In general, what he said, what he thought about himself, what he preached, is all up for grabs in their view. And obviously, they tend to see it through a naturalistic lens, so they will question if Jesus did or did not think of himself as the Messiah. And, he wouldn't be making any prophecies in their view, for example, about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, his return, or, any other prophecies are seen as things that the church put into Jesus' mouth after his life and death. So
interesting. Kingservant, there is a question for you, or a statement, if you don't mind. Can you see it if I put it on? Will you be able to see it?
Oh, yeah. So would I discard the Gospel of Thomas, or do I think it has some value? If so, I think I would completely disregard it as far as learning anything about Jesus. So, where its value lies is in what it can tell us about early 2nd century Gnosticism. It's the earliest source that we have outside the New Testament, and it's questionable with the New Testament whether the New Testament talks about Gnosticism or doesn't. But it's the earliest source that we have from Gnostics, putting across their point of view. That's where its value is. And it's valuable in terms of teaching us about what the early Gnostics were. And sometimes that shed light on more orthodox writings, right? When we have a certain context that we're speaking, if, as, for example, myself, as an apologist, if I'm talking to other Christians and we're all aware of Islam, but none of us are, we express ourselves in particular ways that are relevant because of aware.
Your voice, you're echoing, or there's some your voice is breaking.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Is this clear?
Well, that's better now. Yeah, that's better.
Okay. I think I was resting my mic on my knee, so that was probably why it was going. but yeah, so I think it's valuable in terms of what it can teach us about the early conflicts within people who called themselves Christians. But as far as learning anything about the life and teachings of Jesus is concerned, I think it's basically worthless. That would be my opinion.
Oh, great. Interesting. Really interesting, because I actually got this book, The Five Gospels, What Did Jesus Really Say? And I really find it quite interesting, and it's a good read. And it compares the various Gospels, and of course it adds on the Gospel of Thomas. And it gives you a lot of history information regarding, the early belief system. But thank you, Kingservant. Brother Mustafa, are you with us?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Anything that you want to share and anything that you want to add?
I've just been reading up on some scholarly opinion on what Kingservant has stated about the understanding that the Gospel of Thomas would be a 2nd century document. And that's the general, I mean, it's not general, it's a consensus of majority scholarship, but that is the view. However, there is certain dissenting voices who have made contrary claims to that, in the understanding that there's enough evidence from within the eclectic writings of the Gospel of Thomas, in which there's evidence that it could well have been it could have predated the Pauline epistles as well. So that's been commonly understood, and also there's a notion also that it went through some stages of redaction, which is possible within the 2nd, 3rd century, which would have then introduced the Gnostic tendencies, which have been contrary to the canonical Gospels. So that's also an opinion of certain scholars who take that view that it would have been authentic, but when it went through certain stages of redaction, then it would have implemented such heretical views such as the Gnostic understanding.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting question. Like, what would the Gospel of Thomas look like without any Gnostic influence? That I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Do you have an opinion, Nizam? If you were to take the Gnosticism out of it, what would you have left?
You'll probably have like some of the sayings that are found in the Synoptic Gospels, such as the parable of the seed and the sower, and also like some of Jesus's sayings, like that the blind lead the blind. So I guess you would have these kind of like sayings of Jesus that are found in the Synoptic Gospels is what would remain once we start removing like the Gnostic elements. So this is like Graham Stanton in his book, Graham Stanton from King's College in his book Jesus and the Gospels, I believe, and there's another book called The Gospels Traditions. I think it's in that particular book where Stanton made the point that once, like Thomas in its present form, is from the 2nd century because of its Gnostic tendencies. But once you start removing like the Gnostic tendencies, then it resembles or it parallels with the Synoptic Gospels of the first 3 Gospels. What's interesting is that Thomas doesn't have any I am sayings or any of the statements that are found in John's Gospel. And Thomas is said to represent like a independent stream of the Jesus tradition. So even though it's written like in the 2nd century, if the I am statements were uttered by Jesus, then you would have expected that these sayings of Jesus would have exploded and that they would have been well known in the early church. But even then, like you have Gospels being written about Jesus, like from the 2nd century and forward. But the I am sayings are not found in any of these other Gospels. The sayings that are found in these other Gospels, you'll find that those sayings are also found in the Synoptic Gospels, but none of the sayings of John seem to creep into these other 2nd century or so-called like apocryphal Gospels. And what's interesting about Thomas is like, unlike the other Gospels, Thomas does actually claim to be written by Thomas. So like in its opening, it says something like this is written from the something like the twin, the Didymus, Judas Thomas. So even though I don't believe it was written by Thomas, and I'm not saying that the Gospel of Thomas is the Injil that the Quran refers to, or the original revelation that was given to Jesus. But I just thought it's interesting, and in Thomas, from what I understand, Thomas is represented in the Gospel of Thomas as being the actual brother of Jesus. But in the Gospel of John, Thomas is presented as being like one of the doubting disciples who requires proof or evidence for Jesus. But
Also, just to make a point of, also just to make a point of Kingservant's point of how the looked without the Gnostic sayings, we can also make reference to the certain scholars by the name of Marvin Mayer, who's asserted that the genre of a sayings collection is indicative of the first century, and that in particular the use of parables without allegorical amplification seems to antedate the canonical Gospels. So that's a substantiation of how possibly the Gospel could have looked without the subsequent Gnostic changes, which then perpetuated it in the 2nd century.
Well, of course,
sorry, Kingservant. I just Brother Fuad's been waiting patiently. Sorry, you can continue once I do. Wa alaikum salam, rahmatullah, Brother Fuad. How are you doing, brother?
How are you guys doing? Sorry, I was actually at work. I saw you guys online. Thought I'll buy just a bit. Yeah. All right. So just a few things, like if the fun day, if brother's already finished speaking, I would like to add a couple of things in there.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So yeah, the Gospel of I would totally not agree with anything pretty much that Kingservant said, because first of all, if he's going to give this or he's going to say that the Gospel of Thomas is not written by Thomas, that's why he's rejecting it. Well, first of all, none of the Gospels are said to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is written, all of them are written in third person. John, we know from the very first chapter, even towards the end, it's clear that John is, the Apostle John is not the writer of John. Okay. Then Mark, we know it's written in third person. It's totally anonymous. All of these Gospels are totally anonymous until Irenaeus in the 2nd century. He was the one, he actually named them. Sorry, I hear some background noise.
And you know what's interesting about Thomas is, like, unlike the other Gospels, Thomas does actually claim to be written.
I hear some background noise. Somebody's YouTube is on.
Yeah, I think, brother, is it Nazam, I think.
Okay. If you can put him on mute for a quick second, please. Okay. So, Jazakallah. So then we come to the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 9, verse 9 clearly identifies Matthew to be in the third person. Now, coming to the Gospel of Thomas, as Brother Nazam pointed out, that it does point out that it is written by Thomas. Now, if he's going to reject Gospel of Thomas just because it is dated to 2nd century, where there are plenty of scholars that actually date a part of it, or actually the entire Gospel of Thomas to the 1st century. If he wants scholarship, I can provide scholarship, but at least part of it, yes. And it's actually dated earlier than Gospel of Mark, which is said to be the first ones. For instance, John Dominic Crossan, he's actually of the opinion that the Gospel of Thomas and Q were both developed from an earlier lost, now lost, the quote unquote common saying source, right? So if this is the reason why he's rejecting it, because the anonymity of the gospel, it is just 99% of the scholarship, unless you are a hardcore evangelical, no contemporary scholar actually believes that they're written by who they claim to be. So I would like to see something consistent. Plus the third point that he pointed out, that the Gnostics, I mean, as we know, early on there were, especially in the first 2 centuries, we had the Marcions, we had the Gnostics, which of course they would refer to Gnostics. And Gnostic, by the way, is a general umbrella term that even scholars nowadays, they don't like to use that term anymore, because there were so many different sects with variations in there, right? So pretty much, anything that didn't go in line with the proto-orthodoxy, they would put that in the basket of Gnostics, right? Because it's just a general umbrella term, but this is not a term that is used by scholars these days anymore. I hope he knows this, because Gnostics, from my understanding, they had over 63 different sects, from what I can recall. So and then what about the Jacobists, right? The Jacobists, they were the followers of James. So anything that pretty much didn't go. So the way it went is, you had pretty much 3 different. There were so many sects, but generally speaking, you could divide them into 3 sects, right? You had the Jacobists, that were the followers of James, right? That had their own gospel, such as the gospel of Hebrews, gospel of Ebionites, etc., right? Then you had the Paulist church, right? That later turned into the proto-orthodoxy, right? That is the one that won over. And as we know, history is written by the winners, right? So they literally, wiped them out of history. Anything that they even had in their hands, we don't know. The only thing we know about these groups, exactly what they believed in, or if there were any other gospels out there, is through church fathers in the later 3rd and 4th century. So what we know about these groups is from the enemies, right? From the groups that actually overpowered them. And then we had the Marcionites and the so-called Gnostics. And again, as I said, the Gnostics, it's a general umbrella term. So so my question to him, just summarizing, so my question to him is he actually saying that Gospel of Thomas is not authentic because it is written in the 3rd person? Or is he rejecting it based on the dating? Because dating, I can provide scholarship, that it is from the 1st century, at least a big part of it.
I really want to give Kingservant ample time to respond, to be honest, because I think there was a lot of information for him to unpack. So if Kingservant, you got a couple of minutes to respond if you want to, or you can just take 30 seconds. It's totally up to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, obviously there are a lot of different issues that are being raised, but I will attempt not to miss any of them out. So first of all, the question of why should a person reject the Gospel of Thomas? The difference between the Gospel of Thomas being claimed to be written by someone and actually assuming that it is written by the person who is claiming to have written it. The point here is that there is not one single scholar on the planet anywhere who is qualified on the subject that thinks that the Gospel of Thomas was written by Thomas. I don't care if you go to the most conservative Peter J. Williams or if you go to the most liberal Robert Pratt. You won't find anyone on the spectrum who thinks that the Gospel of Thomas was actually written by Thomas. Now, since the Gospel of Thomas claims to be written by Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas has a blatantly false lie at the very start of its gospel. Therefore, there's no reason that anybody in their right mind would ever accept it as being authentic or the word of God or the words of an apostle who should be trusted. Now, as for the dating, I'm well aware of John Dominic Crossan's position on the Gospel of Thomas and also the Gospel of Peter and so forth. Yes, he does date the Gospel of Thomas to the 1st century, but as Nazam has rightly been pointing out, and I've been agreeing with him, the vast majority of scholars date the Gospel of Thomas to the early 2nd century. And there's very good reason for that, including the fact that the Gospel of Thomas shows knowledge of prior writings which are in the New Testament, and therefore would logically come after them. That's some of the obvious reasons for why nobody should accept the Gospel of Thomas, because Thomas didn't write it, and it says Thomas wrote it. And there's no scholar who disagrees with the fact that Thomas didn't write it. As for the Marcionites and the Gnostics, the Marcionites were a Gnostic sect. They are a sect within Gnosticism who believed that the Old Testament was written by an evil God who is the evil creator of the universe, and that Jesus was paradoxically a higher God who came to deliver us from the evil God who created us. Like, there's nothing in Marcionism that should be taken seriously theologically by Christians, Muslims, Jews, or anybody else. It's disgusting blasphemy and heresy by anybody's standard. I hope we can all agree on that, if we can agree on nothing else. There's only one God, and he is the creator. The creator is not an evil God that we need to be delivered from by a different God. Like, this is insane. It's also ironic that Fawad, first of all, tells us that we shouldn't believe Irenaeus, and then everything he says about Gnosticism comes from the writings of Irenaeus in his series against heresies. Like, he's cutting off the branch that he's sitting on. You can't do this sort of thing if you expect people to...
1 second. When did I make that argument? When did I say anything about Irenaeus not being reliable?
You told us that that's where we get the authorship of the Gospels from, which isn't actually true, but I haven't got around to that point yet. And furthermore, you then used Irenaeus to talk about different sects within Gnosticism. Now, when it comes to alleged other Gospels, like the Gospel of the Ebionites or the Gospel of the Hebrews, thankfully, we have the advantage of knowing what the Gospel of the Ebionites was. It was the Gospel of Matthew, which perhaps may have been doctored by them somewhat, but it was the Gospel of Matthew. And if you're interested in seeing whether the Gospel of Matthew teaches a Orthodox view or an Ebionite view of Jesus, I literally did 2 debates with Al-Yemeni on this very subject, whether it teaches that Jesus is God or not. The Ebionites denied that Jesus is God. That was their position, and they held to this gospel. And it does, in fact, teach that Jesus is God. So they're refuted by their own scriptures. The Gospel of Hebrews, nobody knows what it was. And there's no reason to believe it was 1st century either. There is a possibility that it may have also been the Gospel of Matthew, actually, since Papias refers to the Gospel of Matthew as potentially have been written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, the Gospel of Matthew that we have was not originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Again, there's not a single scholar who isn't 100% committed to church tradition, evangelical or not, that thinks that the Gospel of Matthew we have was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. However, it may in fact be something else that was also written by Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, and Papias may have been conflating the two together. So there's some quite interesting possibilities to consider there, but I'm not going to go in depth on that right now. I'm trying to think if there was, yes, the authorship of the Gospels. This doesn't come exclusively from Irenaeus. This comes from Papias, first of all, but not only from Papias, but you can find references to who wrote the Gospels consistently throughout church history. It's not limited to Irenaeus at all. You can go to basically any church father and his writing to find unanimous consensus, actually, on who wrote the Gospels. There was zero dispute about who wrote the Gospels in the early centuries of Christianity. And I can make that invitation back to Fawad. Can he give me one example of anybody, in fact, I won't even limit it to church fathers, okay? Can you give me an example of anybody, heretic or not, pagan, Gnostic, Christian, anybody in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity who said that the Gospels were not written by the Gospel authors that we have in the New Testament,
Okay.
or that they were written by somebody other than that? Now, I'm not talking about the rest of the New Testament. There were discussions about that, the 4 Gospels specifically. And I would follow that up by pointing out that every single Gospel manuscript with a name on it from the 4 Gospels has the same name that we have on our 4 Gospels. Again, 100% agreement on that subject. So unfortunately, I'm not running away or anything, but my battery just dropped below 20%. So I don't know how much longer I can keep going, but I think that answers, as far as I'm aware, every point that you brought up. And I'll hang around until my battery dies.
Yeah, we got about 15. Sorry, Fuad, 1 second.
Sorry,
We got
go ahead,
15 more minutes before we end the show. So, Brother Fuad, feel free to push back from what Kingservant said.
Sure. So he asked for proof from the early church fathers. Get ready. Justin Martyr, first half of the 2nd century, he references to all of the 4 Gospels in his writings. However, he calls them memoirs of the apostles. He does not refer to them by the respective authorship. Papias he mentioned Papias, I believe, right? While writing about Jesus's writings, he said he derived the information from John the Elder, which is not supposed to be, by the way, a lot of Christians don't know this. Maybe Kingservant does, but a lot of people don't know this, that John the Elder, also known as John the Presbyter, is not John the Apostle, okay? So he says, basically, he referred to Papias, that he derived the information from him in some manner, but he does not clarify. And this is not me, Bart Ehrman, and so many scholars there are of the same opinion, even James Tabor. He says that it is unclear if he got this from John's writings, talking to John, or from people who knew John. Okay, so he asked for early sources from early church fathers. Now, Ptolemy's letters to Flora in first half of the 2nd century. In the letter, Ptolemy quotes a passage from Gospel of John, but identifies the author, John, as simply an apostle. It means that probably Gnostic Christians were not even yet identifying the beloved disciple as John. And for instance, I can debate him on this, whether or not the beloved disciple is actually John or somebody else. But since he asked for it, so here I'm giving him early sources, right? Then we see the Didache, right? The Didache references, which by the way was part of the canon, if not at least part of the canon, it was revered by the first 3 century church fathers and early Christians. Okay, now the Didache references passages from Gospel of Matthew without naming the author. It refers to it as quote unquote the gospel. If he wants more, I can provide it. Now, on the other hand, scholars unanimously, whether it be David M. Carr, whether it be Dale Martin, Dr. David E. Aoun, then we have Ben Witherton, we have Bart Ehrman, we have James Tabor. All of them are the opinion. I don't know where he's getting the scholarship from, that contemporary scholars actually believe that the gospel is not written by anonymous authors. This is like standard scholarship. Every single scholar these days believes that about the anonymity of the Gospels. But I'll leave it at that. And he actually mentioned a couple of other things. He mentioned Ebionites. So Ebionites, I hope, like he listened to what I said. We don't know what the Ebionites believed. We only have parts because of the Nag Hammadi library that was discovered. We only have parts their gospels. We don't know exactly what they believed in. It is very clear that they did not believe in Jesus as God. And also, there were different groupings within Ebionites. Some of them had adoptionist theory, right? That they believed that Jesus was adopted by God the Father at baptism. There are other groups within Ebionites that are said to not have believed such a thing. But I hope he has studied some scholarship on this, because this is like what he mentioned about Ebionites. I mean, one of the things that stand out about Ebionites is that they did not believe in in Jesus to be God, right? But again, what we know about them are written by church fathers later on. So it's like knowing about these groups through the enemies, right? We don't know exactly what they believed in. Then the argument about Irenaeus that he mentioned, well, I just said that Irenaeus is the first one that mentions the Gospels by their respective names as we know them today. That doesn't mean I agree with everything that Irenaeus said. I don't know where he got that from, that I find Irenaeus reliable at all. And then I wasn't arguing, by the way, about Marcionites, whether they are correct or not, right? What I was saying is that, anybody early on, by the way, there are a lot of Christians that actually act like Marcionites. We clearly saw on the PBD podcast how Christians, they love to sort of totally back away from the Old Testament. They almost consider him, to be, or they almost consider the Old Testament to be something that they're somewhat like ashamed of, or they think that it was an old law, it was replaced by the new law. I mean, there are so many horrific things. Why was it that Marcionite actually wanted to totally, stray away from the Old Testament? Is because all these horrific things that he could not actually explain, that why is it that God would do such horrific things in there, right? This is why he sided with the God of the New Testament, which is pretty much what we see Christians doing these days anyway. So even though they might actually say that they believe in the God of the Old Testament, they actually don't. The way they act is not that way. And I guess that would be it, pretty much. I think that's what he mentioned. If I missed out anything, he's feel free to hop on and ask again.
Oh, we just lost connection. Did I just... Brother Kingservant, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here. Sure.
Okay. Any final remarks to what Brother Fuad said?
Yeah, I'd really like to clarify the point that I didn't say that there was unanimous consent among modern scholars about the authorship of the Gospels. There was unanimous consensus within the early centuries across the board. And none of the quotes that Fuad gave show otherwise. He quotes non-Christian sources saying that... Think about how non-Christian sources in the early 2nd century saying the Gospel of John was written by an apostle. That doesn't contradict the fact that I'm saying that no one disputed that John wrote it. And the same can apply to many other things. I mean, he's quite right. Everything you know about the Gnostics, pretty much, apart from what's found in the Nag Hammadi library later, comes from Christian sources. So he likes to discredit Christian sources when they tell you about who wrote the Gospels, but he goes to them to say that there were groups who believed that Jesus wasn't God. And yes, I mean, I know the Ebionites believed Jesus wasn't God, but they accepted the Gospel of Matthew, and that says he is. So, yeah, I mean, you can find lots of sources around the same time as Irenaeus that teach that the 4 Gospels were written by the authors that we attribute to them. So it's not just Irenaeus that this comes from. You can go to Tertullian, you can go to Justin Martyr, who refers to the Gospels as the memoirs of the apostles. And oh yeah, I love the reference to the Didache, by the way, because that gives the Trinitarian formula for baptism as per Matthew 28:19. And again, yes, it refers to the Gospels as the memoirs of the apostles. That doesn't mean that Paul never wrote his letters, or that the Gospels, which is more to the point of our discussion, weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, it's a confirmation that they do come from apostolic origin. So really, the only actual things that were said here were either misrepresentations of what I said. I never said that modern scholars all agree on the authorship of the Gospels. I said that ancient scholars did. So any attacking something I never said is just a straw man thing. Or it's actually a confirmation of what I said, but said with force in such a way as to try to give the opposite impression. So there's really not a lot more, I think, to be said about that. What I said is completely accurate. As far as where the gospel is anonymous or not, they're anonymous in the sense that the writings themselves don't contain the names of the authors, right? That's what people mean when they say that they were anonymous. It doesn't mean that the authors are unknown. You can have a writing which you know who the author is, but the name of the author is not contained within it. That's what it means for the Gospels to be anonymous. And in that sense alone, they are anonymous. And having said that, this isn't, the names of the Gospels were not things that were tagged on later by the early church. There has been a very detailed study by Douglas Moo and D.A. Carson, who, yes, are evangelical scholars, but if you want to listen to atheists, why shouldn't you listen to them too, right? Who have traced these back easily within the first century. In fact, they argue, and I think very convincingly, that there was never a time when these Gospels were circulated without having these names attached to them. They go back right to the very beginning. And isn't that the best explanation, thinking about it reasonably, for why there is no other name ever attached to these? Unlike anonymous writings where we don't actually know for sure who wrote them. And yes, the Gospel of Hebrews, for example, there was debate about who wrote Hebrews. Still is among scholarship today, evangelical scholarship. But in the case of the Gospels, the kind of unanimity that we have among manuscripts, never a different name on them. Among the early Christians, heretics, and pagans, never question who wrote them. What's the best explanation for that? Because everybody knew from the beginning. They were never circulated without these names attached to them. That's logically the most reasonable conclusion to come to. And thank you for giving me the time to speak. I appreciate that, by the way. I know not everybody would.
Brother Muhammad, are you there? I'm not sure if he's wrapping up, but you know, if he wouldn't mind, I would actually respond back to a couple of things that he said. It's we can continue this conversation tonight. I'm having on my channel, inshallah. Me and Brother Ali will be having a live stream. So Kingservant, I don't know what time it would be for you. Might be quite late, but if you can stop by over there, I'll appreciate that, and we can continue this conversation on there. Especially about the the gospel authors being anonymous. So what I would like to say real quick is that first of all, can you provide any scholarship that actually says that the Gospel of Matthew that you hold in your hands today is the same Gospel of Matthew that Ebionites had back in the day? You are aware that Ebionites, these groups, they had their own gospel, right? That is not necessarily Gospel of Matthew. So Gospel of Matthew is a Gospel of Hebrew or the Gospel of Ebionites is predating Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, which Gospel of Matthew, by the way, is supposed to be copied from or heavily copied from, okay? So please update your scholarship on that. And if you have any scholarship, please provide that for me. I want contemporary scholarship. I don't want evangelical scholarship, because with their own bias on there. Now, on top of that, no, they don't have to be atheists. They don't have to be atheists. I don't mind if
you want me to answer that. Who said that the gospel?
Since Brother Muhammad is wrapping up, but you can provide scholarship. However, for every evangelical scholar that you provide, inshallah, God willing, I will provide 10 other contemporary scholars that say otherwise, but nobody
Irenaeus,
in their right minds,
who
they
is the
can
same
actually
source that
believe.
you get everything you know about the Ebionites from, comes from Irenaeus, who says that it was the Gospel of Matthew. So if you do it to disregard him, you have nothing left on the Ebionites whatsoever.
No. What I'm saying is that these earlier groups existed. What they believe, we don't know. You can't say with certainty, neither can I. What we do know that they had their own gospel. That's not the Gospel of Matthew that they had. So I don't know where you get the idea.
Irenaeus, the same guy you get everything you know about them from. He said it.
Irenaeus, by the way, is not the only church father that talks about him. You know this, right? There are other church fathers that have mentioned about Ebionites. You know this, right?
Yeah, but Irenaeus is the source. He's the earliest source you have on.
No. I challenge you on that one. Prove me wrong. So come stop by Dots Connected to Islam tonight. Okay, I challenge you on that position. I will provide to you others, other church fathers that have mentioned about Ebionites. Regardless, even if I were to grant that to you, that he is the source, why do I have to believe anything else that the guy says? What I'm saying is you're probably misunderstanding my position. What I'm saying is that we don't know. Scholars, sorry?
You're cherry picking. It's simple.
I'm not cherry picking.
And you ignore the rest.
Not really. What I'm saying is we don't know what these groups actually believed in. We don't know. There were several groups within there, by the way. What we do know is that some of them, they actually believed in the adoptionist theory, right? From my understanding, none of them actually believed. You made a bold statement. I would like you to substantiate that if we had enough time, that they actually believed in Jesus to be God. This is one of the groups.
I never made that claim.
Right. So then you cannot argue that they actually. So I would want you to actually retract that statement, because you specifically said that they actually believed in Jesus to be God. So as I said, we don't know what they believed in.
He was God. I'm not claiming that they didn't believe he was God.
Okay.
But they did accept the Gospel of Matthew, which teaches that he is God. So they're cutting off the branch.
But again, it's not the same Gospel of Matthew, because these groups predate the Gospel of Matthew.
There is, or has ever been.
Sorry, gentlemen. It seems that we're speaking across each other. I just want to touch point on the Kingservant's last point, where he made mention that he believes that Matthew's Gospel alludes to Christ's divinity. I mean, can you substantiate that? In which capacity you believe that, Kingservant?
Sure. I mean, I did 2 full debates with Al Yemeni on this subject, so I don't mind whatsoever giving you examples from the Gospel of Matthew. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, for example, and my battery's on about 7%, so
it's okay. Mine is exactly at 7% as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, good. So when the angel appears,
do you have access to a charger, Kingservant?
Unfortunately, I don't right now. But
okay.
Yeah, very quickly though, if we go to the Gospel of Matthew, and when the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in verse 21, he says, "She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins." The name Jesus means Yahweh saves, and the angel explicitly says that Jesus is to be called Yahweh saves because he, that is Jesus, and if you go to Greek, this is actually emphatic. It's he himself, Jesus, will save his people from their sins. Jesus is being identified explicitly as Yahweh by the angel here. And that's continued with the quotation from Isaiah 7:14, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son. They shall call his name Emmanuel," which being translated means God with us. I'm not saying because he's called Emmanuel, that means he's God. But given the context that he is identified as Yahweh, who will save his people, Jesus' people, from their sins, that is clearly what is being said here. It should be pointed out as well that in the Old Testament, Jehovah says that he is the only savior. in a spiritual context. So being saved from your sins by a person would necessarily mean that that person is Yahweh anyway. So you've got like a whole collection of proofs just in those two verses, actually.
I'd just like Nazam at this point just to respond to Kingservant's points from Matthew chapter 1. Do you want to give your response to Nazam?
Yeah, so Kingservant, as you know, Yahweh is a verb, so it's an action. So sometimes Yahweh could refer to the name of a person, or sometimes it could also refer to an action. Just like even David, like in the Old Testament, usually it refers to King David, a historical person, but sometimes it's used like as an adjective or like as a descriptive word. So something like this could also be happening in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. But also, if you look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, Matthew says he begins his book with the Genesis of Jesus, which is translated as in the ESV as the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. But where it says genealogy, the Greek word is actually Genesis, and Genesis actually refers to creation. And also in verse 18 of chapter 1 as well, Matthew uses the word Genesis again, and also I believe he also uses the word Genora, which means to come into existence. So if you read Father Raymond Brown's book on the birth of the Messiah, he says there's no sense of pre-existence in the nativity story in Matthew's gospel or in Luke's gospel. So Jesus is created, like he comes into existence when he's conceived. And also in Matthew's gospel, Jesus isn't Yahweh, because in Matthew chapter 12, he's referred to as the servant of Yahweh. And Matthew believes there's only one Yahweh, not two Yahwehs. So you know, like the name Matthew, it's a common name, for example. So it can refer to, like, there's many Matthews, for example. But Yahweh, according to Matthew's gospel and also the gospels, Yahweh is only the Father. So like in the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 64 verse 8, Yahweh is called our Father. He's never called Yahweh our Father or and Son and Holy Spirit, but he's only called our Father. So Matthew doesn't believe that Jesus is Yahweh, but he believes he's the servant of Yahweh, because Matthew chapter 12 is quoting Isaiah, I believe Isaiah chapter 40, where it says that Yahweh will send his servant. And so the servant is Jesus. And Yahweh says in Isaiah 45 that I am God, besides me there is no other.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously I did 2 full debates on does the Gospel of Matthew teach that Jesus is God. And I was actually surprised that Al-Yemeni didn't bring up the argument that you began with, which is based on the word ganao in Matthew 1, and arguing that means that Jesus couldn't be God because he was brought into existence according to this. The answer to that is pretty simple, though. It's that according to Matthew, he is both God and man. And since he is man, his humanity was created. And whatever can be said about either of his two natures can be said about him without qualification. So, you know, that's known as...
So that explanation would only work if you're a Nestorian. So Nestorians believe that Jesus is 2 persons.
This is the
Matthew's
communicatio
one
idiomatum.
person.
This is standard Christology.
Yeah, so if Jesus like comes into existence, like his humanity, that's referring to the self, like meaning the person himself, like the consciousness. Jesus comes into existence. It's not referring to a body, because the body is not the person or the self.
Yeah, but whatever is true about his nature is true of his person. So we can say, for example, Jesus went from Bethesda to Jerusalem. When I said Jesus, I'm speaking of a person, right? But it's not. But I'm saying that as a Trinitarian, understanding that he has a omnipresent nature, But I'm speaking of his human nature when I say Jesus went from Bethesda to Jerusalem. So I'm saying that about his one nature, but I'm naming him the person who is performing the action in his human nature. In the same way I can say that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation, as Paul does. That doesn't mean that I don't think he has an uncreated human nature, as an uncreated divine nature, as well. As for, Matthew didn't believe that Jesus was Yahweh. I mean, Al Yemeni tried to convince me of that for 5 hours and he didn't manage. So I don't think you're going to manage in 5 minutes. Although, I respect the points that you're making. I think some of the arguments that you are giving, not all of them, but some of them are the best that can be made. Obviously, yes, Jesus is the servant of Yahweh. This is the title given to the Messiah and so forth. But that's completely consistent with Trinitarian understanding that Yahweh in those contexts refers to the person of the Father, and Jesus is other than the person of the Father, so he can refer to Yahweh as someone other than himself, without denying the fact that he himself is also Yahweh. There being only one Yahweh, both Matthew and I believe that, and yet that one Yahweh exists as 3 co-eternal persons. Any one of those 3 persons can call another one Yahweh, or my God, or God,
but
for that.
That doesn't.
We do find that the Father calls the Son God. So this is an example of the kind of language I'm talking about. When he says to the Son, excuse me, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, right? This is the Father speaking to the Son and calling him God. Does that mean that the Father is not God? Of course it doesn't, right? There's more than one person who can be called God. That doesn't imply that there's more than one God, unless we assume that each person.
But in that context, he's not being called Yahweh. He's being referred, like in its original context, is Elohim, and he's not being called Yahweh. And also that verse that's cited in Hebrews can also be translated as God is your throne, rather than
what sense does it make to have God as your throne? Like, I know that's what the New World Translation does, but
not just the New World Translation, but also the Good News Bible as well makes a footnote as well that this is an alternative translation. And I believe there's another translation that also gives this alternative translation that God is your throne, and this is basically like saying God is your rock. It's like a metaphor when you say God is your throne, meaning God is your supporter, your provider, your helper, or you represent God. But just because you can make Matthew say what you want, what you believe in, doesn't mean that Matthew had the same theology. So, like, there's parts of Matthew that Muslims can quote and say it agrees with Islamic theology, but that doesn't mean that Matthew himself was a Muslim or believed in the Shahada. So my contention is that none of the New Testament writers, including Matthew, was a Trinitarian, and nor did they believe in that Jesus is both man and God. So there's no verse that says that Jesus is both 100% man and God in Matthew's gospel. But what seems more explicit is that Jesus is created in Matthew, that he comes into existence, and Jesus is God's anointed servant in Matthew's gospel. And even in the gospel of Thomas, Jesus isn't God, but Thomas actually gives a criteria, and he says anyone that is born of a woman isn't God. So I forgot the number of saying. Actually, I have it in my tab. It's saying 15 in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, when you see one who is not born of a woman, fall on your face and worship. That one is your father. So, in other words, anyone who is born of a woman isn't the Father or isn't God. And since Jesus was born of a woman, he's not God or the Father.
Are you sure that the author of the Gospel of Thomas would agree with you that Jesus was actually born of a woman, because the Proto-Evangelium of James denies that, and that is a similarly early Gnostic writing. So I'm not sure, and you know my view of the Gospel of Thomas. I don't care too much either way as far as what it can teach us about Jesus, but I would not at all be surprised if the author of the Gospel of Thomas did not believe that Jesus was born of a woman.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas in its present form does seem to teach that Jesus is a man or a human, at least in outward appearance. But so that would imply if he's human,
in
then
appearance. But that was an early Gnostic belief that Jesus appeared to be God, to be man, but was not in fact human. I'm sure you know about the Docetists and various other groups.
Yeah. So, as you know, not all Gnostics are alike or identical.
Of course, yeah. But you know, you do have the Proto-Evangelium of James, which has Jesus being sort of beamed out of Mary rather than being physically given birth to by her. And that is where some of the Roman Catholic beliefs about the perpetual virginity of Mary come from, and so forth, because they don't believe that she physically gave birth to Jesus. I'm not saying that's what the Roman Catholics strictly believe, but
so is there a sense of pre-existence in the Proto-Evangelical James, or even in the Gospel of Thomas? Does Jesus pre-exist in Thomas or in James?
I think he does in James. I mean, in Thomas, since you've only got a sayings document, I don't think you've got enough information to tell that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm not 100% sure with the Proto-Evangelium of James, but I would think so. I would think that he would pre-exist according to that. But again, you know, these things are a matter of interpretation, because I think he pre-existed according to virtually every book of the New Testament. But I know you're going to disagree with that. So we might similarly disagree on some of the Gnostic writings. I'm not sure.
Yes, so the Gnostic writings, none of them were saying are 100% true or accurate, but they may represent another stream of tradition independently, like of the Gospel of John, for example. So Thomas may have some sayings, according to scholars, that may actually go back to the historical Jesus.
Sure.
And saying 15 may be